Hi there. Human moral instincts. Are they tools for doing good or signals for appearing good? An issue is a lot of what we seem to do that looks moral is perhaps to achieve other kinds of goals than actually doing good. Okay, so here's a guy who's giving to charity ineffectively, at least according to Will McCaskill. Guide dogs for the blind. Okay, not cost effective. But a lot of people around him might be saying, awesome, my hero. And then there's the lone skeptic, the EA person, who's read Robin Hanson, or my book, The Mating Mind, going, are you just showing off personal traits considered morally good to gain social, sexual, and or status benefits, but without necessarily delivering cost-effective benefits to others? And you can get this moral swarming effect among single people, right? People just signaling everything they're doing through words and bumper stickers, et cetera. I'm vegan. I pledge to give 10% of my earnings to deworm total strangers. I'm earning to give, hedge fund manager dollars. Bed nets. I'm saving our potential grandkids from AI X risk. And here again, the skeptic saying, begone, your runaway virtue signaling provokes moral disgust, which is a real thing that people study. On the other hand, if you're more savvy and you have some self-consciousness about this, and you go, I harness my virtue signaling instincts in effective ways to minimize avoidable suffering for all sentient beings, I take that to be a major goal of EA, actually. And I think the better we understand signaling instincts, the better we can do our collective agenda. And then the response is there, let's make babies, instead of skepticism. So virtue signaling has become a really common phrase that people toss around in the last few years. I've been writing about it for about 20 years. It's basically publicly showing off personal traits considered morally good. It may be a reliable signal, an honest signal, or it might be unreliable cheap talk. So if you've got a bumper sticker saying, I did the giving what you can pledge, and you're not giving what you can, it's cheap talk. Or it might be reliable, where it's an honest signal, where people really check up on you. It may substitute for action, as in 90% of Facebook posts in this election season, right? Facebook moralizing, or it might actually deliver real benefits, like you're bragging about being in EA, but you're actually in EA and you're doing good. My argument in this talk is virtue signaling has deep evolutionary roots and important adaptive functions, but it can undermine the appeal, efficacy, unity, and inclusiveness of the EA movement, but we can harness it better to do more good. And I kind of love this one on the right. If you're a vegan who does CrossFit, what do you tell people first as soon as you walk in the room? Ideally, both. Okay, so let's rewind back up a little bit. What's the origin of virtue signaling? Well, life evolved about 3.5 billion years ago. DNA replication is almost perfect, but it's fallible. It creates mutations. You've got to signal your genetic quality to others, ideally, but there's no possible way to do that yet. Nobody cares, because sex only evolved 1.2 billion years ago to spread good genes and purge bad genes. But the result, even then, is boring. You basically get different kinds of algae. Things only got interesting after eyes and visual systems evolved about 500 million years ago. Once you do that, you can do mate choice from a distance. You can select your sexual partners based on visual apparent health and sexual ornaments. And what does that do? Arguably, that leads to the Cambrian explosion of biodiversity, which is partly, I think, an explosion of sexual ornamentation. Ever since the Cambrian explosion, this is going quite quickly through evolution, I understand. Ever since that, evolution's really operated by two key principles: natural selection for efficient survival, but also sexual selection for conspicuous signals of genetic quality, phenotypic condition, behavioral competence, et cetera. And these are a few examples of those conspicuous signals, ranging from the very cute tail flap of the peacock spider, to the guppy tail, to the sand crab building this weird little pyramid, to the peacock's tail, the most familiar example, to the BMW, or red ochre used as body ornamentation that goes back at least 100, 150,000 years. And I've written 4 books that all take advantage of signaling theory to try to explain how we show off a wide array of traits to others, some of which are virtue traits. The mating mind, mating intelligence, spent, and mate. So we have a lot of mental fitness signals, different ways to show off how well our brains work. Some of these are partly practical. They deliver partly real survival or social benefits, and they're partly signals, things like intelligence or language or mental health, or even moral virtues, partly practical, right? Group survival and reciprocal altruism and all that. And some of these traits are mostly for signaling, like I've argued, creativity, music, art, humor, etc. So I'm not saying moral virtues are only for signaling, but they're at least partly for signaling. And the reproductive benefits you get from signaling fitness vary across domains. In the visual arts, Lucian Freud, famous painter, 500 lovers, 14 kids with at least 6 women. Popular music, good reproductive success. Screamin' Jay Hawkins had at least 57 kids, apparently. They got together and compared genotypes about a decade ago. Moral leadership, though, that's where you get the big payoffs. You take over countries and you look good. Stalin, Mao, Fidel Castro, allegedly thousands of sexual partners and hundreds of kids, just flooded the Cuban gene pool with himself. There's a history of virtue signaling theory: Aristotle, Darwin, Nietzsche, Veblen, Spence, and Zahavi. I won't go through that. There they are. Look them up. Virtue signaling, I think, does have some pros, some benefits. It really is, I think, the evolutionary foundation of most altruism that goes beyond your local kin group or clan. It incentivizes a lot of good behavior through social and sexual benefits. It provides role models, reinforces social norms, and teaches youth what's valued in your culture. The cons are it can waste a lot of time, energy, and resources, as in most charitable giving until give well. Most charitable giving, arguably a complete waste. And the signal reliability, what it displays about you in terms of traits, is guaranteed by the conspicuous costs imposed on the signaler in terms of time, energy, and resources, like the charity donations. It's not the benefits delivered to others that actually matter very much in terms of virtue signaling, like the charity effectiveness. One big question is, which personal traits does virtue signaling really signal? One thing, well, raise your hands if you're familiar with John Haidt's moral foundations theory. So about half of you. Good. There's 6 key moral values here: care, justice, liberty, loyalty, sanctity, authority. He covers these in The Righteous Mind. Liberals tend only to care about the first 2. Conservatives care about all 6. This is why Trump is very puzzling. Utilitarians tend to only care about the first one, and the others only insofar as they promote well-being or care or reduce harm. So one issue is EA fails to signal, or adherence to EA principles fails to signal 5 of the 6 things that people really seem to care about in terms of moral foundations. It tends to ignore fairness, because what you want to do is target the people who are suffering the most, not spread benefits equally or in proportion to deservingness. It tends to devalue liberty, for example, where you get a kind of puritanical conformism, like you dare not spend anything on luxury goods or on meat or on nice cars. It values that over pleasurable individualism. It dismisses loyalty, right? So globalism over tribalism, animal welfare over anthropocentrism. If you have loyalty to your tribe or species in the EA community, that's kind of a very primitive viewpoint. The problem is, if you talk that way to ordinary folks, they hear it as you have no sense of loyalty, or you disrespect authority like tradition and conventional moral norms, or you disrespect religion and the, quote, wisdom of repugnance, as Leon Kass called it. So I think one issue for EA outreach and recruitment is to think really hard about how can we signal all 6 of these moral foundations more effectively, not necessarily by changing how we analyze problems, but by changing how we talk about them. I don't really want to get stuck in moral foundations, because I think there are even deeper traits that are really being signaled better. One problem is these moral foundations are relatively new. They're relatively hard to measure. They're not well characterized, and they often are collinear with or correlate highly with personality traits. I've argued that it's better to focus on the semi-moral, quasi-moral traits like cognitive traits or personality traits that are really well studied. A parallel session is about the replication crisis in psychology. That's largely a crisis in social psychology. Individual differences psychology that studies intelligence and personality does not have a replication crisis. We've been studying the big 5 personality traits for 25 years, intelligence, general intelligence for a century. These all show strong reliability, validity, stability, and heritability as traits. So they're really worth getting to know. These, what I call the central 6 traits, these quasi-virtues, intelligence, and the big 5 personality traits, they're all ancient across species. You can measure them in all the other great apes. They're all genetically heritable, stable across life, universal across cultures. They're attractive to mates, friends, and kin. And they're judged fairly accurately and quickly in face-to-face conversation. So I'm going to run through the different traits that I think are most relevant to EA issues. One is low intelligence versus high intelligence. This is a remarkably high intelligence crowd. And that's good in lots of ways, like you can analyze complex things better. The problem comes if you're trying to communicate findings to the people in the middle of the bell curve or even the lower end. Those folks are the ones who are susceptible to buying books like Homeopathic Care for Cats and Dogs, which is not evidence-based. Your cat will die, or giving to guide dogs for the blind. And if you think I'm going to explain my ethical system through Bayesian rationality, you might impress people, you might signal high IQ, but you might not convince them. I think there's a particular danger of runaway IQ signaling in EA. I'm relatively new to EA. I'm totally on board with what this community is doing. I think it's awesome. It's terrific. I'm very concerned that it doesn't go the path that I've seen many other fields go, which is when you have bright people, they start competing for status on the basis of brightness rather than on the basis of actual contributions to the field. So if you have elitist credentialism, like where did you go to school, if that's the first question you ask, or I take more provigil than you, so I'm in a nootropics arms race, or you have exclusionary jargon that nobody can understand without Googling it, or you're skeptical about everything equally just because skepticism seems like a high IQ thing to do, or you fetishize counterintuitive arguments and results. These are problems. If your idea of a trolley problem involves 12 different tracks, then you're probably IQ signaling. A key big 5 personality trait to worry about or to think about consciously is openness to experience. Low openness tends to be associated with drinking alcohol and voting Trump and giving to ineffective charities and standing for traditional family values and being sexually inhibited. High openness tends to be associated with, well, I take psychedelics, or I'm libertarian, or I give to SCI, or I'm polyamorous, or casual sex is awesome. Now, it's weird that these things all come in a package and that these things come in a package, but empirically that seems to be the case. Now, one issue here is that high openness is great. I'm highly open. Most of you guys are too. But what you don't want to do is try to sell people the whole package and say you can't be EA unless you're politically liberal, or unless you're globalist, or unless you support unlimited immigration, or unless you support BDSM or transhumanism or whatever. Right? You can get into runaway openness signaling like the social justice warriors do. And that can be quite counterproductive in terms of how your field operates and how it appears to others. If you're using rhetoric that just reactively disses all of these things, be aware that you're going to alienate a lot of people with low openness, and you're going to alienate a lot of conservative business folks who have a lot of money who could be helpful. Another trait is agreeableness, kind of kindness and empathy and sympathy. So low agreeableness, and this is the trait with the biggest sex difference on average. Men are lower on agreeableness than women. Why? Because we did a bit more hunting and stabbing each other and eating meat. And high A tends to be more cuddle parties and voting for Clinton and eating tofu and affirmative consent rather than 50 Shades. So EA is a little bit weird because this community, from my observations, combines certain elements of high agreeableness. Obviously, you guys care passionately about sentient welfare across enormous spans of time and space. But it tends to come across potentially as low agreeableness, and I think that can be a problem. If you analyze even ethical and welfare problems using just cold rationality, or you emphasize the rationality because you're mostly IQ signaling, it comes across to everybody outside EA as low agreeableness, as borderline sociopathic, right? Because traditional ethics and morality and charity is about warm-heartedness, not about actually analyzing problems. So just be aware, this is a key personality trait that we have to be really careful about how we signal it. The high agreeableness tends to be things like traditional charity, where you have a deontological perspective, sacred moral rules, sentimental anecdotes. We're helping people with this well in Africa that spins around, children push on it, awesome, whatever. You focus on vulnerable cuteness, like charismatic megafauna if you're doing animal welfare. You focus on in-group loyalty, like let's help Americans before we help Africa. That's not very effective, but it's highly compelling emotionally to most people as a signal. And the stuff that EA tends to do, all of this, facing tough trade-offs, doing expected utility calculations, focusing on abstract sentience rather than cuteness, that can come across as quite cold-hearted. EA so far, in my view, I haven't run personality questionnaires on all of you, but my impression is it tends to attract a fairly narrow range of cognitive and personality types. Obviously high IQ, probably the upper 5% of the bell curve. Very high openness. I doubt there are many Trump supporters here, right? I don't know, probably not. Uh-oh, a lynching on the Berkeley campus. And in a way, there might be a bit of low agreeableness combined with abstract concern for sentient welfare. It takes a certain kind of lack of agreeableness to even think in complex, rational ways about welfare. And of course, there's a fairly high proportion of nerds and geeks, i.e. Asperger's syndrome, me as much as anybody else here, with a focus on what Simon Baron-Cohen calls systematizing over empathizing. So if you think systematically about things and you like making lists and doing rational expected value calculations, that tends to be a kind of Aspie way to approach things. The result is, if you make systematizing arguments, you will come across as Aspie, and that can be good or bad depending on the social context. If you do a hard-headed or cold-hearted analysis of suffering, that also tends to signal so-called dark triad traits: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and sociopathy. And I know this is a problem socially and sexually for some EA folks that I know, that they come across to others as narcissistic, Machiavellian, or sociopathic, even though they're actually doing more good in the world than the high agreeableness folks. I think virtue signaling also helps to explain why EA is prone to runaway signaling of intelligence and of openness. So if you include a lot more math in your talk than you really strictly need to, or more intricate arguments, or more mind-bending counterfactuals, that might be more about signaling your own IQ than actually solving relevant problems. I think it can also explain, according to the last few slides, about why EA concerns about scalability, tractability, globalism, and problem neglectedness can seem so weird, cold, and unappealing to many people. So I think to start wrapping up, it's important that we harness these kind of narcissistic display instincts in the service of maximizing sentient utility. Virtue signaling runs deep. I've argued it has roots in biological evolution, well, not quite as deep as the trait signaling of other things 500 million years ago, but at least 1 or 2 million years ago in humans, possibly a deeper time in social primates who date back 70 million years. We could ignore it, as most humans have done. Like, you dare not talk about virtue signaling, that's a taboo topic. We can fight it and say, no, it's invalid. It's ethically invalid. It's philosophically invalid. Let's pretend nobody should ever do it, or let's try to talk people out of it. I think that's wildly naive. That's not going to be a successful movement. Or we can use it to our benefits. We can figure out, okay, in an ideal world, arguably people wouldn't do virtue signaling, but they do. How do we work with the grain of human nature rather than against it? So I think the better we understand it, the better we can grow our movement, improve its marketing, align our heads and hearts, and do more good. I think for the future, a key issue will be which virtue signaling systems will we, humanity, adopt in the coming decades? This is a map of countries in proportion to population size. If you sort of take China and India, everything else is kind of rounding error, basically. The key thing is what virtue signaling systems will China and India adopt. That'll kind of set the standard for the rest of the world. And I think if we can nudge those countries, which are rapidly getting wealthier and are going to be, if EA succeeds at all in 50 years, that will mean it succeeds in China and India, not just over here in this little pocket of the world. Conversely, if we fail to develop better virtue signaling systems, I think that'll increase existential risk quite a lot. It'll undermine future sentient welfare. And this is, I think, a high leverage place where we can think strategically about how to grow the EA movement, and also where we can kind of police each other. And if you see somebody virtue signaling, don't dismiss them. Don't treat them with contempt. Don't say, oh, you're doing nothing more than virtue signaling. You aren't either, probably. You might just be IQ signaling by calling them out with your skepticism and your insightful analysis. But that might not be any better than them signaling their openness or their agreeableness. Okay, I think astonishingly to me, I'm almost on time. So do we have about 2 or 3 minutes for questions?
I think we're just going to do questions afterwards.
Okay, let's do questions after. Thanks for listening.